The smoke still rises from that clearing when I close my eyes. Not the acrid black of burning plastic or the clean white of campfire wood, but something else. Something organic and wrong, like hair and old bones and things that should have been buried long ago. It's been 3 years since I torched that den in the Shawnee National Forest, and I can still smell it. Worse, I can still feel the weight of what watched me do it. My name is David Marsh, and until that October night in 2021, I was a wildlife damage control specialist for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. Nuisance animal removal, they called it on the paperwork. What it really meant was dealing with the things that scared farmers enough to call the state. Coyotes taking calves, black bears in grain silos, the occasional cougar that wandered too far from the Ozarks. I'd done the job for 11 years without questioning much. You learn not to overthink when you're pulling a 3-day-old deer carcass from someone's well. But that autumn was different. Southern Illinois had been experiencing livestock killings that didn't fit any pattern I'd seen, or any pattern in the manuals, the textbooks, or the quiet conversations veterans had over bourbon at wildlife conferences. Sheep torn open but not eaten. Calves killed with what looked like tool precision. Throats crushed by something with a grip stronger than any bear. And the tracks. Christ, the tracks. I'd been tracking the thing for 6 weeks when I found the den, a limestone outcropping near the Big Muddy River, hidden behind a collapse of sandstone that you'd only find if you were looking, or if you'd been reading the landscape the way my grandfather taught me to read deer runs. The entrance was low, maybe 4 feet high, but wide. The ground around it was compressed and worn smooth, not from weather, but from use, from passage. I should have called it in, should have waited for backup, for biologists, for someone with more letters after their name and less weight on their conscience. Instead, I poured 15 gallons of diesel fuel into that cave, struck a road flare, and threw it into the dark. The sound that came out wasn't animal, wasn't human either. It was rage made audible, a frequency that bypassed my ears and went straight to the primitive part of my brain that still remembers when we were prey. I ran, and it followed. The weeks leading up to that night had unraveled like a slow-motion car crash, the kind where you see every frame of disaster approaching, but can't seem to move your hands to the wheel. It started with Harold Yancey's call on September 12th. Harold ran a small cattle operation about 15 miles south of Carbondale, a third-generation farm that had survived droughts, floods, and the slow economic strangulation of industrial agriculture. What it couldn't survive was losing 2 calves in 1 week to something that took only the organs and left the rest to rot in the field. Not coyotes, Harold said when I arrived, his voice flat with the exhaustion of a man who'd stopped sleeping. Coyotes eat. This thing, it's doing something else. He was right. The kill sites were surgical. The first calf had its liver, heart, and kidneys removed through a single incision along the rib cage. Not torn, incised, as if by claws designed with anatomical knowledge. The second was worse. It lay in the northeast pasture, still warm when I found it at dawn, its throat crushed with such force that the vertebrae had separated. But there were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle, just compression marks in the mud around it, prints that made my stomach drop. They were canid, unmistakably. The four-toed pattern, the claw marks, the proportions, but they were wrong. Too large, easily 7 inches from heel to toe. And the stride, when I followed them back toward the tree line, was nearly 4 feet between prints. No wolf had ever walked the Shawnee. No dog breed I knew could leave marks that deep. I took plaster casts, photographed from every angle, measured twice, 3 times, hoping my eyes were lying. They weren't. That night I spread topographical maps across my kitchen table, marking every kill site reported in the past 2 months. 18 incidents, scattered across 4 counties but clustered along waterways, the Big Muddy, the Cache River, seasonal creeks that ran through bottomland hardwood forests. The pattern suggested an animal that needed cover, fresh water, and hunting corridors between human settlements. My grandfather had been a trapper in these woods during the Depression. Before Alzheimer's took his memory, he'd told me stories that I filed away as folklore, tales of wood devils that walked on 2 legs during full moons, creatures that the Shawnee tribes had known enough to avoid. Old men's stories, I'd thought. The kind of thing you entertain with a polite smile and forget by morning. I went into my attic and found his journals. 70 years of observations written in the cramped cursive of a man with an 8th grade education and a PhD from the forest itself. October 1947. Found tracks near Pounds Hollow. 6 toes on hind foot. Too smart for traps. March 1952. Lost a hound to something with hands. Charlie said he heard it laugh. Charlie, don't lie. I read until sunrise, until the words blurred and my coffee went cold. Then I loaded my truck with trail cameras, scent bait, and every tracking tool I owned. For 3 weeks I became nocturnal, sleeping in 2-hour shifts during the day and spending nights in the forest with thermal imaging equipment borrowed from a fish and wildlife friend who didn't ask questions. The Shawnee at night is a different world, a layered darkness where sound travels strange and every shadow has weight. I learned its rhythms, the 3 a.m. patrol of raccoons, the owl territories, the places where deer wouldn't go even in hard winters. And I found the anomalies. Trees stripped of bark at 7 feet high, claw marks too deep and deliberate to be from marking behavior, scat deposits that contained bone fragments, fur, and things I sent to the state lab without explanation. The reply came back inconclusive. Canid markers present but cellular structure anomalous. Recommend additional samples. On October 8th, one of my trail cameras captured something. Not a clear image. Thermal bloom from body heat, motion blur, the LEDs reflecting off eyes set too far apart and too high off the ground. But in 3 frames you could see the outline. Bipedal posture, arms longer than human proportion, and a skull shape that suggested both dog and something older, something that evolution had branched away from millions of years ago. I showed it to exactly one person, Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist at Southern Illinois University who specialized in cryptic carnivores. She studied the images for 20 minutes without speaking, then looked at me with something between fascination and fear. If this is real, she said carefully, you need to stop looking for it alone. And if I report it? She closed her laptop. You'll spend the next year giving interviews instead of tracking, and it will disappear. These things always do. That night I went back to my maps. The kill patterns had shifted. The attacks were moving east following the Big Muddy upstream, getting closer to hiking trails, to campgrounds, to places where a missing person wouldn't stay missing for long. I had a responsibility. Not to the state, not to science, but to the people who walked these woods without knowing what else walked there. My grandfather's last coherent words to me 3 days before the nursing home echoed back. Some things don't want to be found, and some things need to be stopped before they learn to hunt what we love. On October 15th, I found where it denned. The limestone outcropping sat on private land, 140 acres owned by a timber company that hadn't logged it in 30 years. The forest there was old growth, the kind of cathedral darkness where sunlight negotiates with leaves and loses. I'd approached from downwind, moving through a creek bed to mask my scent, every step calculated to avoid the snap of dead branches. The entrance was hidden behind a rock slide that looked natural until you studied the pattern. Stones had been moved, repositioned to create a baffle, something to break line of sight from the outside. Around the opening, the ground was packed hard and stained dark with what field tests would later confirm was blood. Not human. Deer, raccoon, opossum. The architecture of an apex predator's larder. I didn't enter. Every instinct I'd learned from tracking black bears screamed against it. Instead, I set up a concealed camera 30 yards upslope and settled in to wait. 4 hours passed. The October sun tracked west, throwing shadows that stretched and merged into the general dimness of forest twilight. I'd almost convinced myself to pack out when I heard it, a sound like wet leather sliding over stone, rhythmic and deliberate. It emerged from the den at 6:47 p.m. I'd prepared myself, thought I'd understood what I was looking for. I was wrong. Photographs don't capture presence. Thermal images don't convey the wrongness of something that moves with predatory intelligence but breaks every rule of mammalian locomotion. It stood 7 feet tall, maybe more. The body was heavy with muscle, covered in dark fur that seemed to drink the failing light. The head? God, the head was the worst part. Canid, yes, but elongated, with a snout that suggested wolves the way wolves suggest dogs. An older template, something closer to the root code. The ears were mobile, tracking sounds I couldn't hear, and the eyes caught the last rays of sun, reflecting green gold with a depth that suggested not just intelligence but consideration. But it was the hands that made my breath stop, not pause. Hands, 5-fingered, with an opposable thumb and claws that curved like surgical tools. It was carrying something, a fawn, limp and fresh killed, gripped by the neck with casual strength. For 30 seconds it stood there, perfectly still, scenting the air. I'd chosen my position for elevation and wind, But those eyes scanned the ridgeline like it knew the forest had been disturbed, like it was reading the space between trees for human presence. Then it turned and loped back into the cave with a gait that was neither bipedal nor quadrupedal, but something in between, fluid and powerful, and utterly alien. I didn't move for another hour. When I finally extracted myself, my legs were cramped, and my hands shook so badly I could barely work the camera's memory card free. Back in my truck, I watched the footage 6 times. Each viewing confirmed what I already knew and didn't want to accept. This wasn't a known species. This wasn't a wildlife management problem. This was something that redrew the map of what could exist in these woods. I called Sarah Chen at midnight. She listened to my description without interrupting, then said, "You need to bring this to the university. Tonight." And then what? Task force, media circus? Every amateur cryptozoologist in North America descending on Pope County. David, if that thing decides a human is prey, it hasn't. In 2 months, 18 livestock kills, 0 human contact. That you know of. She was right, and we both knew it. 3 hikers had gone missing in the Shawnee over the past year. Search and rescue found 2 of them, hypothermia and misadventure. The third, a graduate student from Kentucky, simply vanished between 2 ridges on a clear September afternoon. I pulled his case file that night. 23 years old, experienced backpacker, spot device that sent its last ping from coordinates less than 2 miles from the den site. The search had focused on ravines and sinkholes, operating on the assumption that he'd fallen, but his pack was never found. Neither were his boots. At 3 a.m. I stood in my kitchen with a decision that had no good outcome. Report it, and risk driving the creature deeper into territory where it might encounter more humans. Stay silent and carry the weight of every future incident. Or, I looked at the 15 gallons of diesel fuel I kept for the generator, at the road flares in my emergency kit, at the map where I'd marked the den with a red X, my grandfather's voice from one of those bourbon-soaked conversations 30 years ago. Sometimes mercy looks like a match. Sometimes protection means making sure no one else has to see what you've seen. I knew what I was going to do. I also knew it was wrong by every regulation, every ethical standard of wildlife biology, every principle I'd sworn to uphold. But when you've seen something that shouldn't exist carrying fresh prey into a cave 2 miles from a public campground, principles become abstract and diesel fuel becomes concrete. I loaded my truck before sunrise. October 16th, 2021, 4:17 p.m. I parked 3 miles from the den site and walked in with the diesel fuel distributed across my pack in a duffel bag. The weight was punishing. Over 100 pounds of equipment, fuel, and the crushing certainty that I was crossing a line that had no return path. The forest was quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a healthy ecosystem, but the held-breath silence that comes when prey animals sense an apex predator's territory. No birdsong, no squirrel chatter, just the whisper of October wind through oak leaves and the sound of my boots on limestone. I'd timed my approach for late afternoon, banking on the creature's crepuscular hunting pattern, most active at dawn and dusk, resting during the day's brightest hours. The trail cameras I'd placed 3 days earlier showed it leaving the den around 6:30 p.m. and returning near dawn. A 4-hour window. Enough time if I was lucky. The den entrance looked different in daylight. Smaller somehow. Less ominous. Just a hole in the rocks. Dark and still. I spent 20 minutes watching from cover, listening for any sound of movement from within. Nothing. Just the tick of cooling stone and the distant call of a crow. I moved to the entrance and aimed my flashlight into the dark. The beam penetrated maybe 15 feet before the cave curved away, but in that cone of light I could see what I'd missed on thermal cameras. The walls were marked with claw grooves, deep parallel cuts that suggested both purpose and frustration. Territory marking, maybe, or something else. Communication that predated language. The floor was littered with bones, deer vertebrae, rib cages from smaller mammals, and in the back, just visible before the darkness swallowed everything, something that reflected my light with a dull gleam. Metal, a buckle maybe, or a zipper pull. My hands were steady as I unscrewed the first fuel can. Training took over, the mechanical process of preparing a controlled burn, except there was nothing controlled about this. I poured diesel in a wide arc around the entrance, then used a stick to push 2 cans deeper into the cave, listening to them tumble and splash across stone. The smell was overwhelming. Petroleum and death, and the mineral cold of deep earth. I pulled a road flare from my belt, struck it, and held the sputtering red light like a torch in some ancient rite of banishment. This was the moment, the last second where I could still walk away, still call Sarah, still do this the right way. The flare hissed and spat sparks onto my glove. I threw it. The diesel caught with a soft whoomp that became a roar, flames racing into the cave like something living, something hungry. Heat slammed back at me, singeing the hair on my exposed arms. Black smoke began to pour from the entrance, thick and greasy with burning fur and things I didn't want to identify. For 10 seconds, nothing. Just fire and smoke and the crackling of superheated stone. Then the sound came. It started deep, subsonic, a vibration I felt in my chest before my ears registered it as noise. Then it climbed in pitch and volume, becoming a howl that was part rage, part pain, part something I have no words for. The sound a nightmare makes when it realizes it can bleed. I ran. Behind me I heard crashing, rock fracturing, the sound of something massive moving through fire and smoke and not caring about the cost. I hit the creek bed and splashed through water that soaked my boots, my thermal image disappearing into cold flow, old hunter's tricks to break a scent trail. But this thing didn't track by scent alone. A tree exploded to my left. Not fell, exploded, bark and splinters showering the forest floor. I glimpsed it between the trunks, a burning shadow, parts of its fur still smoking, moving with a speed that made mockery of its size. It wasn't chasing me. It was herding me, cutting angles like a wolf on a deer, driving me away from roads and help and witnesses. I broke right, scrambling up a talus slope that cost me skin and fingernails but gave me elevation. At the top I turned, bringing up my rifle, a .308 loaded with rounds meant for black bears, and found it standing 40 yards downslope. We locked eyes. In that moment I understood 3 things with perfect clarity. First, that it wasn't going to kill me. Not yet. It wanted me to understand what I'd done, what I'd destroyed. The den wasn't just shelter. It was territory, sanctuary, perhaps the only place left where its kind could exist unseen. Second, that it was alone, completely, cosmically alone. The last of something that had outlived its time by retreating to the margins, to the forgotten spaces between human progress. And I'd just burned its last refuge. Third, that it would follow me. Not for revenge. Revenge is human. But for something older than revenge. For the same reason wolves follow wounded prey, because that's what predators do when they're cornered and have nothing left to lose. It turned and loped back toward the burning den, smoke still rising from its shoulders, and disappeared into the forest with a silence that made my gunfire irrelevant. I hiked out in darkness, my flashlight beam jerking across trees that all looked the same, every shadow deep enough to hide something that now knew my scent, my gait, my fear. I reached my truck at 11 p.m., drove home with the windows down and the heat off, trying to freeze the smell of burned hair from my nostrils. In my driveway, I sat for 20 minutes before I could make my hands unclench from the steering wheel. The motion sensor light above my garage flickered on, then off, then on again. Something was in my backyard. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every sound became amplified. The furnace kicking on, the ice maker in the kitchen, the old house settling on its foundation. Normal sounds, except now they were camouflage for the other sounds I was listening for. The scrape of claws on siding, the soft thud of something heavy landing on my roof, the sound of breathing that wasn't my own. At 2 a.m. I sat at my kitchen table with my rifle across my lap and my phone in hand. Sarah Chen's number pulled up but not dialed. The cursor blinked. My finger hovered. I couldn't press send. What would I say? I burned a cryptid's den and now I think it followed me home? I committed what amounts to ecological terrorism based on fear and instinct, and now I need help? Instead, I pulled up my computer and started documenting everything, not for a report, for a record. The kind of thing you write when you're not sure if you'll be around to testify. October 16th, 2:47 a.m. Field notes, unofficial. Encountered unknown large canid species, designated UCL1, unidentified cryptic lupine. Estimated height 7.5 feet bipedal stance. Weight 400 ton or 500 lbs. Morphology suggests convergent evolution between canidae and early hominid structures. Hands fully articulated, opposable thumbs. Dentition unknown but presumed hypercarnivorous based on kill patterns. Den located at coordinates redacted. Evidence of long-term habitation. Bone deposits suggest varied diet. White-tailed deer, raccoon, opossum, Possible human remains, unconfirmed. At 16:35 hours initiated den immolation using diesel accelerant. UCL1 emerged during combustion, demonstrating high pain tolerance and immediate retaliatory behavior. Pursued observer for approximately 0.8 miles before disengaging. Current status: unknown. Recommend immediate area quarantine and specialized tracking team. Recommendation unlikely to be filed. Observer potentially compromised judgment through independent action outside departmental protocols. I read it back. It sounded insane. It sounded like exactly the kind of document that ends a career and starts an investigation. I saved it to an encrypted drive and closed the laptop. The motion sensor fired again. I moved to the kitchen window, careful to stay back from the glass, and peered into my backyard. My property backed onto 20 acres of unincorporated woodland. One of the reasons I'd bought the place. Privacy. Space. Now that space felt like a highway for something that had tracked me across 15 miles of forest in complete darkness. The sensor light illuminated a circle of lawn, my tool shed, the firewood rack. Nothing moved. But at the edge of the light, where grass met tree line, I could see disturbed ground, long furrows like something heavy had been dragged, or like something heavy had been digging. I grabbed my thermal monocular and scanned the woods. Heat signatures bloomed. A deer bedded down in brush, the fading warmth of my truck's engine, a possum in the oak tree. And there, behind the shed, a shape that didn't match any animal I knew. Large, low to the ground, perfectly still, watching. As soon as my thermal found it, it moved. Not away, deeper into cover, repositioning to stay at the edge of detection. Tactical awareness. It knew I was looking, knew what technology I had, and it was adapting. I made a decision, grabbed my phone and texted Sarah. Need to talk, urgent, not phone, in person. Her reply came 90 seconds later. Campus security office. 6 a.m., come alone. The next 3 hours crawled. I drank coffee that tasted like metal and watched the tree line with mounting certainty that I'd made a catastrophic error. Not in burning the den, though that was bad enough, but in assuming the creature would simply retreat, simply accept the loss and move on. Nature doesn't work that way. Wolves don't abandon territory without testing boundaries. Bears don't forget the human who destroyed their den. And whatever this thing was, it had intelligence that made wolves look simple. At 5:15 a.m. I packed a go bag. Laptop, trail camera memory cards, my grandfather's journals, every piece of evidence I'd accumulated. If this was my last day in the field, someone needed to know what I'd found. The drive to campus was surreal. Normal people doing normal things. The 24-hour McDonald's serving breakfast, a garbage truck making rounds, students stumbling back from parties, a world that had no idea what lived in the spaces between their streetlights. Sarah was waiting in her office, not campus security. She looked like she'd slept as poorly as I had. "Show me," she said. I spread everything across her desk. Photos, plaster casts, video footage, the thermal image from my backyard. She studied each piece with the focused intensity of a scientist confronting data that violated every model she'd been trained on. "Jesus Christ, David. This is..." She stopped, started again. "This is career-defining. This is the most significant cryptid evidence I've ever seen. It's also following me. You don't know that. It was in my backyard, 3 hours ago, watching my house." She sat back. "What did you do at that den?" I told her. Everything. The diesel, the flare, the sound it made, the chase. When I finished, her face had gone carefully neutral, the expression scientists use when they're recalculating everything they thought they knew about you. "You destroyed a potentially singular specimen's only known shelter based on, what? Fear it might hurt someone? It killed livestock for 2 months. It's getting bolder. The missing hiker is speculation. David, do you understand what you've done? Not just ethically, but practically? If that creature was territorial, you just made it homeless. If it was defensive, you just made it aggressive. And if it was intelligent enough to track you home..." She didn't finish. Didn't need to. "I need help," I said. "Not reporting, not publicity. Help figuring out what happens next." Sarah pulled out a map of southern Illinois and marked my property, then marked the den site, then marked every kill location I'd documented. "If this thing is following established patterns, it needs water, cover, and hunting grounds. Your property gives it all 3, plus something new. What? Proximity to the threat. You violated its space. Now it's violating yours. It's not revenge. It's re-establishing dominance, showing you that it can reach you whenever it wants. So what do? She met my eyes. You give it a reason to leave. Food, probably. Fresh kills placed in neutral territory, a pattern that draws it away from human areas. Or, you finish what you started. You track it down, and you kill it, and you spend the rest of your life knowing you exterminated something that might have been the last of its kind. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, morning was breaking over campus, normal and bright and completely disconnected from the decision sitting between us like a third presence. There's a fourth option, I said slowly. I let it follow. I document. I learn its new patterns. And I find a way to coexist. That's not an option. That's a prayer. My grandfather lived in these woods for 60 years. He saw them. He knew they were there. And he died in his own bed at 89. Different time, different forest, different world. But she didn't say no. And in that silence, I found something that felt like permission. I spent the next week becoming nocturnal. Slept in scattered 2-hour shifts. Motion sensors wired to my phone. Cameras covering every approach to my property. I stopped going to the office, filed for emergency personal leave, and let my supervisor think I was having some kind of breakdown. It wasn't far from the truth. The creature returned every night. Not to attack. Not even to threaten, really. It circled my property like something doing reconnaissance, testing my awareness, my patterns. Twice I caught it on thermal just standing at the tree line, perfectly still for 20 or 30 minutes, watching my house the way I'd watched its den. On night 4, it left something. I found it at dawn, a deer haunch, placed deliberately on the stump I used for splitting firewood. Fresh kill, still warm, precisely severed at the femur with cutting efficiency that spoke of immense bite force and anatomical knowledge. The meat was untouched, not a feeding, a message. I called Sarah. It's bringing me food. Dominance display, showing you it's a better hunter, or showing me it understands reciprocity. David, it could have killed me a dozen times by now. My backyard is 30 yards from my bedroom window. I'm the slowest, least aware target it's ever hunted. But it hasn't. It's communicating. Silence on the line. Then, what are you going to do? Talk back. That night I took the deer haunch and placed it at the edge of the tree line, in clear view of my cameras. Then I set up a folding chair 20 feet away, positioned a Coleman lantern for light, and sat down with my rifle across my lap and a thermos of coffee, waiting. At 11:47 p.m., the motion sensors pinged. The deer haunch was gone. In its place, a stripped skull, clean as if beetles had worked it for weeks. Another message. Another move in a conversation I was only beginning to understand. I stood up slowly and spoke into the darkness. I'm sorry. The words felt absurd and inadequate and absolutely necessary. I didn't understand. I thought I was protecting people. I was wrong. The forest absorbed my voice and gave nothing back. I continued anyway. I know you're there. I know you're listening. I don't know what you need, but if you give me time, maybe we can figure out how to share this space without... A branch snapped. Close. Maybe 15 yards into the tree line. I brought the rifle up, not aiming, just ready, and caught a glimpse of reflected eyeshine before it vanished. I'm not leaving, I said. This is my home too, but I'll respect yours if you respect mine. For 3 nights I repeated this ritual, sitting in the cold, speaking into darkness, leaving offerings of raw meat that disappeared before dawn. My supervisor called twice. I didn't answer. Sarah stopped by on night 6 and found me half asleep in the chair, frost on my jacket. You look like hell, she said. I'm making progress. David, this isn't sustainable. You can't live like this. I can until it decides I'm not a threat. And if it decides you are, I didn't have an answer for that. On night 8, October 24th, everything changed. I was in my chair half dozing when I heard it. A sound that wasn't wind or wildlife but breathing. Heavy, controlled, close enough that I could feel the displacement of air. My eyes snapped open. It was standing 10 feet away, close enough to see details the cameras had missed. The fur was darker than I'd thought, almost black, with silver guard hairs that caught the lantern light. The face was broader than a wolf's, more bear-like in mass but canine in structure, with a jaw that could probably bite through a moose femur. And the eyes, amber in daylight, they glowed soft gold in the darkness, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. We stared at each other. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just held its gaze and tried to project calm. tried to show it that I understood the risk we were both taking. It sat down. The gesture was so unexpected, so deliberately non-threatening that I almost laughed. This 7-foot apex predator, this thing that had haunted my nightmares for 2 weeks, sat on its haunches like a dog waiting for dinner. Slowly, glacially slowly, I reached into the cooler beside my chair and pulled out a packaged steak, still wrapped. I held it up, let it see what I had, then underhanded it across the space between us. The creature caught it, not with its mouth but with its hand, plucking it from the air with casual precision. It tore the packaging with one claw, sniffed the meat, and then did something that nearly stopped my heart. It took a single bite, chewed thoughtfully, and set the rest down in front of it. Not hungry. This wasn't about food. What do you want? I whispered. It cocked its head, ears swiveling forward. Then it stood, and God, the size of it standing was overwhelming, and walked to the edge of my property. It looked back once, a clear gesture, then loped into the forest. I followed. I know how that sounds. I know every survival instinct, every training manual, every horror story says you don't follow an apex predator into the dark. But something in that glance communicated safety, or maybe mutual interest, or maybe I was so sleep-deprived and desperate that I was reading human emotions into animal behavior. Either way, I grabbed my flashlight and went after it. It led me on a winding path through the woods, moving slow enough that I could keep up, occasionally stopping to make sure I was still following. After 20 minutes, we emerged at a ravine I'd never seen before, one of those erosion cuts that appears on no map, hidden by deadfall and dense undergrowth. At the bottom, partially concealed by rocks, a body, human, male, advanced decomposition but still identifiable by the bright blue jacket and the backpack that hadn't rotted yet. I recognized both from search and rescue photos. The graduate student from Kentucky, missing for 14 months. The creature sat back on its haunches again and watched me, waiting. I climbed down into the ravine, careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary. The body showed no signs of predation, no bite marks, no feeding. The kid had fallen. I could see the impact point on the rocks, the way his leg was bent, and simply never gotten up. Probably died of exposure over hours or days, calling for help that never came. The creature had found him, and instead of feeding, instead of treating him like prey, it had, what? Guarded the body? Kept other scavengers away? For more than a year? I looked up at those amber eyes. You wanted me to find him. It didn't move. Didn't need to. The answer was in the act itself. Thank you, I said, and meant it. We stayed there for maybe 10 minutes, me and this impossible thing, sharing space over a tragedy neither of us had caused but both of us had witnessed. Then it stood and melted back into the forest, and I was alone with the hard work of calling in a recovery team and explaining how I'd found him, without explaining what had shown me the way. The recovery of Tyler Morrison's body made regional news for about 48 hours before being buried under election coverage and a factory fire in East St. Louis. The official story, the one I told the state police, the one that went into reports, was that I'd been tracking unusual animal activity in the area and stumbled across the ravine by chance. They didn't push. Missing hiker found. Closure for the family. Case closed. The ME ruled it accidental death by exposure. Exactly what the evidence showed. No one asked why it took 14 months for someone to find a body less than a quarter mile from a marked trail. But Detective Sarah Kowalski asked. She'd been the lead investigator on Tyler Morrison's disappearance, had coordinated searches that covered hundreds of acres. She came to my house 3 days after the recovery, badge out but manner casual, and sat at my kitchen table like we were old friends. That's some hell of a coincidence, you finding him, she said. I was tracking unusual animal activity. Yeah, I read your statement. Thing is, we searched that area. Twice. Once with dogs, and once with infrared flyovers. You're telling me we missed a ravine big enough to hide a human body? I met her eyes. You're telling me search and rescue is infallible? No. I'm telling me that you look like you haven't slept in 2 weeks. You've been on emergency leave from a job you've never missed a day at, and you found a body in terrain that doesn't match your usual work patterns. She leaned back. So I'm asking, as someone who wants the same thing you do, which is making sure no one else goes missing, what really happened out there? I had a choice. Tell her the truth and watch her face cycle through disbelief, concern, and the eventual conviction that I was suffering some kind of stress-induced psychosis, or give her enough truth to be useful without crossing the line into credibility-destroying revelation. There's an animal in those woods, I said carefully. Large predator, species unknown. It's territorial but not aggressive toward humans. It found the body, and it made sure I found it too. It made sure. Yes, this predator. You've seen it? Multiple times. And you haven't reported it because the moment I do, this place becomes a circus. Media, trophy hunters, academics, tourists, whatever this thing is, it's managed to stay hidden for decades, maybe centuries. It doesn't need that attention. Kowalski studied me for a long moment. You know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds. And you're still saying it. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you strike me as someone who'd rather know an uncomfortable truth than accept a comfortable lie. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo, plaster cast of a track, taken during one of the Morrison searches. Large canid print, too big for wolf or dog. We found this half a mile from where you found the body. Our tracker said it was probably a hoax, somebody using fake feet to mess with us. But it was in mud that had been protected from rain, and the depth was consistent with something weighing at least 300 pounds. 400 minimum, I said. And it's not a hoax. Jesus Christ. She put her phone away. Okay. Say I believe you. Say there's some kind of undiscovered predator out there. What's your plan? Coexistence. It's shown me it can tolerate human presence if we respect boundaries. It brought me to the body as what I can only interpret as a gesture of, I don't know, trust maybe, or acknowledgement that we both care about these woods. You're anthropomorphizing. Maybe. Or maybe we don't give animals enough credit for complex thinking. Kowalski stood. I'm not putting this in any report, but I'm also not going to pretend I didn't hear it. If someone else goes missing, if there's any indication this thing is a threat, I'll report it. You have my word. She paused at the door. For what it's worth, I grew up in these parts. My grandmother used to tell stories about things in the woods that walked like men but weren't. I always thought they were just stories to keep kids from wandering too far from camp. Now I'm not so sure. After she left, I sat in the silence and realized the isolation I'd been living in for 2 weeks was starting to crack. People were noticing. People were asking questions. And sooner or later someone was going to push hard enough that the whole thing would collapse into either revelation or intervention. That night, Sarah Chen called. Channel 12 wants to interview you about finding the Morrison kid. They're playing up the local hero tracker angle. Tell them I'm not available. David, you can't hide forever. I can try. Listen to me. You're not just dealing with an unknown predator anymore. You're sitting on evidence that could rewrite North American ecology. And you're making unilateral decisions that affect public safety, scientific knowledge, and potentially the survival of a species. That's too much weight for one person. What are you suggesting? Controlled study, limited team, strict protocols, absolute discretion. We document, we learn, and we figure out a conservation strategy that doesn't involve burning down dens or hiding bodies. And when word gets out, we manage it, carefully, like they did with spotted owls, with red wolves, with every other cryptic species that suddenly became public knowledge. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe there was a path forward that didn't end in either the creature's death or its exposure to a world that would treat it as either monster or commodity. But I'd seen those amber eyes watching my house. I'd felt the intelligence behind them. And I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't spotted owls or red wolves. This was something that had chosen invisibility, that had evolved not just biologically, but behaviorally to stay hidden. I need to think about it, I said. Don't think too long, because ready or not, this is coming out. Someone's going to get a photo or another body's going to turn up or you're going to make a mistake. And when that happens, you want to be ahead of the story, not buried under it. She was right. I knew she was right. But knowing didn't make the choice easier. That night, the creature returned. I heard it moving through my property around 2 a.m., the now familiar sound of something large trying to move quietly. I went to the window and saw it sitting at the tree line watching the house. We stayed like that for maybe an hour. Me at the window, it in the darkness, neither of us moving. A vigil, an acknowledgement. 2 territorial animals learning to share space. When it finally left, I found something new on my firewood stump. A shed antler from a white-tailed buck, still fresh, the velvet not yet fully stripped. A gift, or maybe a message I didn't have the context to decode. I brought it inside and added it to the growing collection of evidence I didn't know what to do with. Physical proof of an ongoing relationship with something that, according to every scientific database, didn't exist. The weight of that evidence was starting to feel less like validation and more like burden. November the 1st arrived with the first real cold of the season. Ice formed in the birdbath. The woods took on that brittle quality where every footstep echoes and breath hangs visible in the air. I'd been on leave for 3 weeks. My supervisor had stopped calling, which meant either he'd given up on me or he'd started the paperwork for dismissal. I didn't care. The normal world, offices and regulations and the comfortable fiction that we knew what lived in our own forests, felt increasingly irrelevant. The creature's visits had become routine, almost companionable. It would appear around dusk, sometimes with offerings, bones, antlers, once a perfect riverstone, sometimes just to sit at the edge of my property and watch. I'd stopped carrying my rifle, started leaving the back door open, just to see what would happen. What happened was nothing. It never came closer than the tree line, never violated the invisible boundary we'd established through 2 weeks of careful negotiation. Until November 3rd. I was splitting firewood, mind half on the rhythm of the mall and half on a podcast about wolf reintroduction, when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not forest sounds, human sounds, voices, multiple voices getting closer. I set down the maul and listened. 3 people, maybe 4, moving through the woods behind my property with the casual noise of people who didn't think they needed to be quiet. Laughing. One of them had a radio playing tinny country music. Hunters. Early bow season for deer. My stomach dropped. The creature was territorial. These woods were its hunting ground. And humans crashing through with noise and scent and weapons were exactly the kind of threat that could trigger a defensive response. I grabbed my binoculars and caught sight of them through the trees. 4 men all wearing orange vests, one carrying a compound bow, the others with rifles. Legal hunters on what they probably assumed was public land. My property line wasn't well marked, and the timber company land behind me had permissive access. Normal people doing a normal thing in an abnormal situation they had no idea existed. I started toward them, planning to politely redirect them away when I saw movement in the peripheral. The creature, low and fast, circling to put itself between the hunters and my property, positioning the way a shepherd dog positions sheep. Except these weren't sheep, and one of them had just spotted something. "Holy shit, you see that?" The voice carried clear through the cold air. "See what?" "Something big. Like really big. Just went behind that deadfall." They stopped walking. I saw the one with the bow nock and arrow. The others brought rifles to low ready. Professional, careful, exactly what you'd do if you thought you'd spotted a black bear. I broke into a run. "Hey!" I shouted. "Private property! You need to move back toward the road." They turned, startled. The bow came down. One of the rifle guys, middle-aged, beard, expensive gear, raised a hand in apology. "Sorry, man, didn't realize. We'll clear out. Now, please. It's important." Something in my voice must have communicated urgency, because they didn't argue. Started backing up toward the trail they'd come from, eyes still scanning the woods, adrenaline making them jumpy. The creature watched from the deadfall. I could see just the outline, the shape of its head tracking the hunters as they retreated, calculating, measuring threat. I positioned myself between them, arms spread, and looked directly at where I knew it was hiding. Mouthed the words, "Not them. They're leaving." For 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes, nothing moved. The hunters kept backing away. The creature stayed frozen, and I stood there like some kind of deranged peacekeeper, trying to communicate across a species barrier that shouldn't even exist. Then it shifted, not toward the hunters, toward deeper cover, choosing retreat over confrontation. I watched the hunters disappear down the trail, listened to their voices fade. When I was certain they were gone, I walked to the deadfall. "That was too close," I said to the empty air. A branch snapped behind me. I turned to find it standing in full view, maybe 20 feet away, closer than it had ever come during daylight, close enough to see the individual guard hairs in its coat, the scars on its muzzle, the way its chest moved with breathing. It took a step forward. I held my ground. Another step, close enough now that I could smell it. Musk and wet fur and something wild that had no equivalent in my olfactory memory. It sat down, the gesture I'd come to recognize as non-aggressive. But this time, after sitting, it did something new. It extended one hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled. I stared at that hand. 5 fingers, black pads, claws that could open me like a letter. An offering? A request? A gesture of trust so profound that my rational mind screamed warnings while something deeper recognized the significance. I knelt down slowly and extended my own hand. We stayed like that, two predators from different branches of the evolutionary tree, hands extended but not quite touching, close enough to feel the heat radiating from its palm, close enough to see the pulse in the veins of its wrist, close enough to trust. After maybe 30 seconds, it pulled its hand back, stood, and without hurry or drama walked back into the forest. I stayed kneeling for a long time after it left, staring at my still extended hand and trying to process what had just happened. Every protocol I'd ever learned said I'd made a catastrophic error. Every instinct I'd honed over years of tracking said I'd just experienced something unprecedented. That night I called Sarah. "I need to bring you out here." "To your property?" "Yes, but alone. No team, no equipment, no cameras, just you." "David, if you want to study this thing, if you want to document it, you need to understand it first. And understanding starts with trust. Mine and yours." She was silent for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then, "When?" "Tomorrow, dusk. Come alone and come quiet." Sarah arrived at 5:47 p.m. on November 4th, parking her Subaru at the end of my driveway and walking up with the careful posture of someone entering unknown territory. I met her at the door, handed her a thermos of coffee, and led her to the chair I'd been occupying every night for 3 weeks. "No cameras?" she asked. "Not tonight. Tonight we just observe." "David, if we can't document, we document by watching, by learning. The same way researchers spend years gaining the trust of mountain gorillas before attempting any formal study. This isn't a specimen, it's a relationship." She wanted to argue. I could see it in the set of her jaw. But she also trusted me enough to sit down and wait. The creature appeared at 7:23 p.m. I heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath, the soft, "Oh my God," that came out more prayer than exclamation. The creature sat at the tree line, exactly where it always did, those amber eyes reflecting our Coleman lantern. "It's real," Sarah whispered. "Yes, it's beautiful. I'd never thought of it that way, but she was right. Terrifying, yes. Impossible, yes. But there was a terrible beauty in something that had managed to outlast extinction, outthink detection, outlive its own mythology. We watched it for an hour. It watched us back. No drama, no revelation, just 3 mammals sharing space and acknowledging each other's existence. When it finally stood to leave, Sarah stood too. "Wait," she called softly. It paused. She reached into her bag, slowly, telegraphing the motion, and pulled out an apple. Held it up, then rolled it gently across the ground toward the tree line. The creature watched it roll to a stop, looked at Sarah, then picked up the apple with that impossible hand and took a bite. It chewed thoughtfully, set the apple down, and melted into the darkness. Sarah sat down hard like her legs had given out. "What the hell are we going to do?" "We're going to protect it," I said. "Document it eventually, yes. Study it, carefully. But first and always, we protect it. Because the second this becomes public knowledge, it becomes endangered not by habitat loss or disease, but by curiosity, by fear, by the human need to own and categorize and control. That's not science. No, it's ethics. And ethics has to come first." We stayed in that backyard until well past midnight, talking through possibilities. Limited study, strict confidentiality. A small team of researchers who understood that some discoveries were responsibilities, not opportunities. It would take years. It would require patience and secrecy and the kind of discipline that runs counter to every publishing pressure in academia. But it was possible. Over the next 3 months, we built that protocol. Sarah recruited 2 other researchers, a conservation biologist and an ethologist who specialized in great ape cognition. We met weekly at my property, always at dusk, always small and quiet. The creature began to tolerate their presence, began, very slowly, to interact. We learned it was female, likely between 20 and 30 years old based on tooth wear and scar patterns. We documented vocalizations, tool use, territorial behaviors. We found 2 other individuals, possible mates or offspring, operating in the broader Shawnee ecosystem. None of it was published. All of it was recorded in encrypted files with distribution limited to the 4 of us. We became curators of a secret that grew heavier and more precious with each observation. On February 17, 2022, I returned to work, filed a report about the Morrison body recovery, submitted my backlog of paperwork, and accepted a formal reprimand for my unauthorized leave. My supervisor never asked what I'd been doing. I think he didn't want to know. The creature, we privately called her Artemis, though we were careful never to anthropomorphize in our notes, continued her visits, less frequently as winter settled in, but regular enough that I could mark time by her presence. Once a week, sometimes twice, she'd appear at the tree line, sometimes with gifts, sometimes just to sit. On the night of March 8th, she brought something different, a second individual, smaller, with lighter coloring, and a posture that suggested youth, offspring, maybe 3 or 4 years old. She sat at the tree line and the juvenile mimicked her, learning by example how to interact with the strange hairless apes that occupied the territory edge. I watched them from my window and understood what I was seeing. Not just coexistence, but generational teaching. She was showing the next generation that humans could be tolerated, maybe even trusted if approached correctly. It was the most hopeful thing I'd witnessed in years. Sarah stood beside me, camera in hand but not raising it, just watching. We're part of their world now, she said quietly. Or they're part of ours. Does it matter? I thought about that. About boundaries and territories and the invisible lines we draw between wilderness and civilization, animal and human, known and unknown. About my grandfather's journals and the stories he'd carried to his grave, because he understood that some truths were better as mysteries. No, I said finally. I don't think it does. 3 years later, I still live in the same house, still work the same job, though my focus has shifted toward conservation easements and habitat protection. The timber company land behind my property is now protected under a private trust, paperwork handled by Sarah through channels that don't mention why we consider those particular 140 acres critical. Artemis still visits. Less often now. She's older, moves with the careful gait of an animal managing pain, but she comes. And when she does, she sometimes brings the juvenile, now approaching adolescence, who's learned to accept human presence with the casual tolerance of a deer that's figured out backyard gardens aren't worth the risk. I've never told anyone outside our small research group what happened that October. The den site has regrown. The char marks faded under moss and new vegetation. If someone found it now, they'd see a cave. Just a cave. Nothing special. I still have the shed antler she gave me. Still have every piece of evidence locked in an encrypted drive that will, per my will, be released to the Smithsonian 50 years after my death. Long enough for the world to change. Long enough for perspective to matter more than sensation. Some nights, I sit in my backyard with coffee and silence, waiting for the motion sensors to ping. Sometimes they do. Sometimes Artemis emerges from the tree line and we share space the way old neighbors share a fence line, acknowledging boundaries, respecting differences, finding peace in coexistence. And sometimes she doesn't come, and I'm left with just the forest and the stars and the knowledge that out there, in the spaces between our understanding, things still exist that we haven't named or claimed or destroyed. I burned a den. I made a terrible choice born from fear and inadequate wisdom. But from that ash, something grew that I never expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. A bridge between species that might be the most fragile, most important conservation work I'll ever do. The world doesn't need to know about Artemis. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What it needs is the humility to accept that not every mystery requires solving, not every creature requires documentation, and not every encounter requires conquest. Some secrets of the forest aren't discovered, they're entrusted, and I intend to keep that trust until the forest reclaims us both.